Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. They called Fort Redwood a place that hardened people or broke them. On the first morning Ariana stepped off the transport van, the air smelled like wet pine and diesel. It was early. Lights still hummed along the barracks. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun, jacket zipped up against the chill. People watched, more out of habit than curiosity. Civilians were supposed to be background noise here. She carried a thin notebook and a civilian badge, which made her invisible to some and suspicious to others. The instructors glanced, the recruits straightened, and Sergeant Parker barely looked up from his clipboard. "Move along," he muttered like a man who'd seen too many faces and forgotten most names. Ariana moved anyway, steady steps that didn't match the softness they expected. She let them underestimate her. It made things easier. She'd come to Fort Redwood on paper as a logistics contractor, supply chains, inventories, basic coordination. The job description sounded safe. The reality was different. Marines move fast and hard, they don't stop for paperwork. The base itself was a study in controlled chaos, vehicles lining the gravel, orders shouted over radio static, the clank of tools and the low thrum of generators. People learned to listen for the crack in the noise that meant trouble. Ariana had an ear for that crack. Logan, Reeves, had the kind of face that didn't reveal much. He stood apart from the rest, not because he wanted to, but because the rest needed room to breathe when he moved through them. He saw people the way a surgeon sees tissue, what could be cut away, what needed careful handling. When he noticed Ariana, it was because she fixed more than she reported. She moved like someone with a map already in her head. That drew attention, and attention was dangerous here. The recruits joked at first. A civilian showing up in the middle of Marine drills was like a dog wearing boots, awkward and bound to slip. They threw minor tests at her, a misrouted crate, a swapped manifest, a wrong frequency on the radio. She handled them all the same, calm, precise, no drama. Each time she corrected a mistake, the chuckles faded. Quiet competence is a strange kind of offense at a place like Fort Redwood. It exposes the practiced bluster of those who rely on noise rather than skill. One afternoon changed everything. A training lift went bad, metal groaned, a crate slipped, and a recruit's leg got pinned under the edge. Panic hit like a second wave. People surged without thinking, voices high and chaotic. Ariana dropped her clipboard and moved through the scramble with a clarity that felt like sunlight cutting through a storm. She took command without asking, piecing together orders that stopped the worst from happening. 3 on the count, 1 steady on his head, use the bar for leverage, she ordered, voice even. They obeyed because someone had to speak plainly. The recruit was free before Sergeant Parker even reached them. That moment shifted how people saw her. You can't unsee someone pulling you out of a wreck. Afterward, whispers trailed her like dust. Some called it luck. Others called it arrogance. Logan smiled once, a small thing, when he caught her looking at the sky after the commotion had settled. "You didn't flinch," he said softly. She looked at him, eyes tired and older than her 29 years. "You can't flinch and expect to keep calling yourself brave," she said. He didn't press. He'd seen the shape of guilt on men before, it fit her like a familiar coat. By the end of the week, she was no longer invisible. The mess hall fell quiet when she walked in, not out of respect but curiosity. Soldiers are a crude audience, they notice the ones who don't fit their scripts. Ariana didn't join the chorus of stories or the jokes. She kept to her corner, ate on time, worked through the night reorganizing inventory until it had no loose ends. People started to watch her the way they watch someone who can light a match in a storm, dangerous usefulness. Fort Redwood breathed its routines, but underneath it all something like a storm was gathering. A past that she thought buried wanted to speak, and a future that hadn't realized it needed her was beginning to make demands. The name Logan muttered once, Iron Wolf, was a small seed. Ariana pulled her collar tighter and kept walking. Whatever she had been, whatever they thought she was, wouldn't be decided by their glances. It would be decided by the moments she chose to step forward. Not long after the crate rescue, Fort Redwood stopped treating Ariana like background noise. The whispers built into a current, and currents in a place like this pull people where they don't want to go. Rumors spread faster than orders. She'd done fieldwork before, she moved like command, she didn't look afraid. Parker scowled as if the very air changed around her. That scowl turned into small vendettas, deliberate delays in briefings, withheld comms, a swapped manifest that made a convoy take the long route under the worst sun. Those were the petty things. The bigger test came when the base scheduled a full logistics run, a simulation meant to push trainees and their contract support to the limit. It was supposed to be a controlled problem set, broken radio, stalled vehicle, manual manifest transfer. Instead, someone in the chain put real danger into the exercise. The convoy moved out across Raven Pass, a narrow cut of road that hugged cliffs and threaded through gullies. Ariana monitored from the command tent, hands steady on her tablet. She'd plotted the routes the night before, anticipated choke points, flagged alternate passages. Around noon, the second truck in the line, an older transport with a failing transmission, stalled in a spot that left no room for maneuver. That could have been routine. It would have been routine. But then the ground under the shoulder gave way, and the rear of the truck slid toward the edge like a slow-motion inevitability. People shouted, radios tangled with static, and the line behind had nowhere to go. Parker was out of range. The comm tech froze. Panic is an infection, it spreads because people want to offload responsibility. Ariana cut through the noise. She told the driver to cut the engine, told the third truck to reverse using hand signals, and ordered 2 men to rig a haul line to the spare anchor in less than a minute. She sounded like a woman who had rehearsed the gesture 1,000 times and hated the practice. They listened because the only alternative was watching metal, men, and mission disappear. Once the immediate hazard was controlled, the accusations began. Parker's face was a granite mask. He barked about insubordination, chain of command, and civilian interference. Some recruits echoed him out of habit, tradition is a drug at camps like Fort Redwood. But others, quiet ones who had seen Ariana work, stood in her stead. Logan stepped between Parker and the group with a calm that felt like a shield. She kept a convoy from being lost, he said, voice low enough it didn't become a battle cry but loud enough that it allocated credit where it was due. Parker's mouth worked, but he had no solid ground to stand on. The issue should have ended there. It didn't. That afternoon, a sedan with government plates cut through the gate. 2 men in plain suits, efficient and cold as closed lockers, were escorted into Parker's office. They asked for platoon reports, manifest audits, training logs. They asked pointedly for the civilian who'd taken charge in Raven Pass. When Parker gave them Ariana's name, the head guy nodded like a man who'd been handed the clean edge of a blade. "We'll take a look," he said, and his look meant more than his words. Logan watched the exchange with a tightening expression. He had a sense, less a thought than an instinct, that these men didn't come for paperwork. They came for answers that some people preferred to remain buried. After the men left, the base atmosphere shifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Soldiers moved with a new calculation. Ariana felt it like pressure at the base of her skull, an old friend returning, the taste of attention that meant past decisions were unspooling. The photograph in her locker, the one with her old team, felt heavier in her pocket. Memories tugged at the corners of her vision, the night crashes, the shouted orders, the empty stretch where faces used to be. She told herself she was prepared, that if they asked about Burnlight she would answer with only the facts. But the facts had teeth. That night, Parker called her into the office. The room smelled like stale coffee and authority. He read her the lines about safety violations and chain of command, his tone more ritual than interrogation. Then he folded his hands and slid a printout across the desk. Someone had flagged her as a person of interest in an internal review. Not a complaint from a recruit, not a minor reprimand, an internal review. "You understand what that means?" he asked. The way he said it suggested he already believed the worst. Ariana's pulse steadied into the cold logic she'd learned to use like a tool. "I do," she said. "Then be prepared. They'll want statements. They'll want timelines. And they won't stop at this base." She left Parker's office with a dossier she hadn't been allowed to see, a warning she hadn't invited, and a name murmured under breath at the mess hall, Fort Horizon. The word settled in her like a premonition. When she found Logan outside, staring at the ridge where the sun left a smear of fire, she didn't offer explanations. He didn't ask. He only nodded once, the kind of nod that formed an unspoken pact. They both knew the moment Ariana chose to step forward had become a choice with consequences larger than a convoy or a scuffed ego. There were people who had noticed the way she acted in crisis, and there were people who had reasons to pull her back into the past she tried to bury. The first formal knock had come. The real fight was starting. The next morning the base felt smaller, like a town that had been told a secret. People walked with measured steps, conversations thinned, and every glance felt like it might carry a question. Ariana kept working, but the work shifted. She wasn't just cataloging supplies, she was watching patterns, who filed reports late, who avoided eye contact, which radios went cold at odd hours. Fort Horizon had been named twice now in corridors and whispers, as if the name itself could pull dust from dark corners. Logan kept his distance in public, but in private he was closer than anyone else had been since she arrived. That didn't remove the pressure, it just distributed it. The inquiry team came the next week. Not just paperwork types this time, officers with clipboards who asked the kind of questions that felt like careful picks at a scab. They wanted timelines, unit rosters, comm logs. They wanted to know where she had been 3 years ago and why she had listed herself as a contractor now. Ariana answered with the tight economy she'd learned under fire, dates, locations, the bare facts. She didn't offer context, because context is where people get trapped. They recorded her answers, asked for fingerprints, and took her photograph under sterile lights. The line between civil and military blurred until she was a name on a screen again, not a person. That was the first obstacle, being reduced to paper. While the investigation unfolded, more active problems piled on. Someone leaked an old photograph to the base server, a grainy image of a patch, an insignia with a wolf, and people recognized it too quick. Rumors that she was Iron Wolf circulated openly. Parker's scowl hardened into a campaign. He began putting her on logs that ensured she was present everywhere and watched. The recruits were ordered to report any unauthorized activity. It was a methodical narrowing, like tightening a noose with regulations instead of rope. The strangest thing was loyalty fraying where she expected it least. A junior officer that Ariana had helped a week earlier, moved by gratitude, was suddenly reassigned to another unit. A tech who had once adjusted her radio casually now watched consoles like a guard. Trust, it turned out, is fragile where people's careers are on the line. Logan noticed it too. He started bringing her small bits of information, offhand comments, flags on reports, a notation that a drive had disappeared from evidence after an initial intake at Fort Horizon. Those details added up to a pattern that looked ugly. Ariana found herself pushed toward choices she had avoided for years. She could cooperate with the inquiry, hand over what she knew and hope the system did what it was supposed to do. Or she could withdraw, go underground, and try to find the proof herself. The first option was a gamble that had cost her everything before, the second was dangerous in ways that made her stomach tighten. That tightening became a tool. She realized that inaction was a choice too, and a passive choice would likely get people hurt. One night she went to Eagle Ridge Safe House, the place she had left ready for contingency years ago. Sitting alone in the dim light, she spread out old maps and encrypted notes she had tucked away. The safe house smelled of cold metal and dust, and that scent matched the memory of being the only one awake while the world burned. She found a list, names, operation codes, a reference to Fort Horizon's secure storage. A single line had been circled in ink 3 years ago, drive recovery pending. Someone had planned to secure data, and someone had failed or had been ordered not to. While Ariana worked, Marcus, Logan, kept watch outside. He rounded up people who would be useful and quietly tested their loyalty. He asked questions that had nothing to do with rank: who visits family on what day, who donates to which charity, who has unexplained vacation time. Small things that reveal character. He also had his own problem. Parker had been pushing him to distance himself from Ariana. "Keep your head down," Parker said once, all thin menace and official caution. Logan didn't like being told to keep his head down. He didn't like the implication that doing the right thing would get him punished. So he chose a different path. He would help, but only in ways that didn't leave obvious traces. Resistance came from other directions too. An internal security audit flagged Ariana for repeat, unapproved field activity. That meant her movements would be tracked, her access restricted. Parker used that to his advantage, limiting her ability to access parts of the base. It was a clever play. Let bureaucracy do the dirty work. She found herself physically prevented from the storage bays and the comms room where she once fixed radios by touch. The base that had felt like a place she could move through with her eyes closed suddenly required forms, signatures, approvals. Faced with these constraints, Ariana made a decision that would define this stage of the war. She would not wait to be cleared. She started to assemble a small circle, people who had seen the cost of silence, who had no reason to cover up anything. A former tech with a grudging loyalty, a cook who knew every schedule and every guard rotation, and Logan, whose instincts kept them out of direct line of sight. They planned small things first: watch guards shifts, mirror patrol routes, map blind spots, actions that felt like retrieving a lost map piece by piece. Each small success built momentum and also danger. Each small success moved the noose just a little farther from her neck and a little closer for the people who had buried her team. Night raids on old servers, quiet exchanges of encrypted files, a borrowed uniform for a slip into a restricted area, all of it accumulated risk and evidence. Sometimes things almost went sideways: a guard who recognized Logan, a camera that blinked at the wrong moment, Parker showing up where he wasn't expected. Once, the team had to improvise a story when a checkpoint asked for identification. The cook claimed Ariana as his sister who'd been delayed returning from a training detail. Lies layered on top of truths, each one needed to be credible. The more they lied, the more they anchored themselves to the decision to keep going. By the time the week closed, Ariana had a partial inventory of where the missing drives might be, and a clearer sense that Fort Horizon's files were not simply misplaced but deliberately sanitized. She also had another problem: the person who had been quietly watching from the shadows at the edges of the base had moved closer. Someone had recognized the way Ariana moved during the flood and now watched for it as if waiting for a repeat performance. That person carried a small camera and a disciplined patience. They were patient in a way that made the nights longer. Facing tightened security, fractured loyalties, and an enemy that used rules as weapons, Ariana realized the path forward would require not just skill but a willingness to choose what mattered over what was safe. She had stepped forward to stop a truck from sliding into the ravine. Now she had to step forward to make a whole truth come back into daylight. The choice was no longer theoretical, it was a plan with names, times, and places. And when a plan moves from thought to action, everything changes. Night fell like a curtain as Ariana, Logan, the tech, Maya, and the cook, Benny, slipped into position. The safe house had been a staging ground for a week of small risers. Tonight they were going for the vault. Fort Horizon was supposed to be untouchable, a place where paper and power hid the worst of human mistakes. Standing on the ridge above its lights, Ariana felt the old cold settle into her bones, the clarity that comes when the world narrows to a single objective. They moved fast and silent, training folding into them like muscle memory. Logan took point on the perimeter, Maya carried the kit that could open a locked data locker in less than a minute, Benny carried morale and extra keys, because the world often needs someone who knows the right joke at the wrong time. The breach went smooth for the first 10 minutes. Maya's fingers danced, the lock gave with a soft metallic sigh, and the storage room's hum swallowed their breaths. The racks looked like a city block of sleeping machines. Ariana found the folder names she'd traced for weeks, Operation Burnlight, Alpha 9, Internal Liaison, and everything that had been scrubbed now sat raw and naked on the screen. She downloaded while Logan watched the door. The world outside ran on predictable logic, guards on schedule, cameras on a loop. They exploited that logic. That was their advantage and their lie. Then the loop broke. A camera blinked, a guard changed his route. Someone had updated a patrol without posting a notice to the log. Security moved swift and sharp, like teeth closing. Alarms cut the night. Logan swore and pulled them into a side corridor. The extraction plan went sideways in a heartbeat. They were trapped in a maze of cold concrete and fluorescent light. Ariana felt the old fear, the one that had made her lose men once. It pressed at the places that still healed. She steadied herself and moved like she had in every impossible place before, first assess, then act, never panic. They improvised. Benny's grin got them through an encounter with an entry guard. He claimed to be a late-shift cook from a satellite facility, a story bought with nerves and a greasy apron. It worked. They found a duct crawl that led closer to the perimeter. They climbed, scraped, and breathed through the duct until it spat them into the shadow of the east wall. Outside, headlights cut the horizon, response teams. Someone had called for everything. Ariana had the drives. That was the hard part. Now they had to live long enough to use them. She made a choice in the space of a breath. They wouldn't just run, they would force the system to listen. They set up a relay on a nearby ridge, something that would push the files into the open and make the leak impossible to bury. Maya hummed as she configured the uplink, fingers steady even as the world behind her burned. Logan watched the ridge and watched the road. He saw the first vehicles arrive, the silhouettes of men he'd trained with, faces he trusted enough to have once followed into worse places. There was no time to be sentimental. Pierce showed up himself, the kind of presence that smells of control. He walked into the edge of their world with 2 officers and a pistol that looked like an argument. "You shouldn't have done this, Ariana," he said. The voice was bored and sharp all at once. The rest of the compound closed in behind him like a theater filling for a terrible show. Parker appeared too, his expression paper-thin rage. The 2 men represented the machine that had tried to erase a truth. The machine now had their attention. Words were exchanged, Pierce with his smooth indictments, Parker with his righteous fury. Ariana stood with the drives in her hand like proof and a promise. "You buried my team," she said, simple and final. "You hid what you did." The camera on the ridge counted the stars and the tense breath between them. Pierce smiled in a way that meant calculation. He offered a negotiation, the kind that dissolves into threats when you refuse. Logan stepped forward, not to fight so much as to stand where a line must be drawn. He was a solid wall. The first blow landed quick, a stun grenade tossed to blind and disorient. Chaos bloomed. People moved in practiced violence. Logan took a hit to his shoulder and kept moving. Benny ran, the clutch of his apron a small relic of a life that had moments of absurd bravery. Maya screamed once when a guard found her terminal, the sound was a broken wire in the night. Ariana ran toward the uplink, shoved the drive into the transmitter, and hit the sequence that would rip open Fort Horizon to daylight. Pierce lunged, reached for the console. Ariana pushed back with a handful of everything she had left. Hands closed around her wrist, she tasted metal and rain and the memory of men she failed to save. For a moment, everything paused in that specific the way the world sometimes pauses before the bottom falls out. Then the broadcast began. Documents, video, intercepted comm logs, orders with signatures, everything spilled across channels they couldn't control. Pierce's face turned from anger to panic. Parker's voice became something raw and small. Men who had believed they could erase a history found that a million small screens now knew what their hands had done. The first public feed landed on a civilian news server within minutes, then another, then a senator's aide got the packet and forwarded it as if her fingers were shaking. The machine couldn't put a lid back on what the light showed. They didn't walk away unscathed. Logan carried a wound that would scar. Benny ended up with a limp and a story he told with a laugh that sometimes cracked. Maya lost the comfort of anonymity, her name became a data point in a new argument. Ariana watched Pierce hauled away by his own men, his face a mask of everything he expected not to feel, shame. Parker disappeared into the churn of investigations, too small for the scale of what they revealed. By dawn the compound looked different, like a landscape after a storm. Men moved with the fatigue of people who'd been given back truth. The feeds were relentless. The truth had teeth. Ariana sat on the ridge and let the sunrise wash the night away. She thought of her team, names that would finally be read aloud. She thought of the choice that had pushed her to break the law and pry open the world. Choices have consequences, some small, some monumental. Tonight had been a reckoning. When Logan sat beside her and made no speech, she understood what had happened. They had gambled and paid and won a small and necessary victory. The future was unmade, raw and vulnerable. They had exposed a rot that ran deep. That didn't mean the system would heal quickly. It meant the rot would be visible, and visibility is a dangerous kindness. Ariana closed her eyes, felt the first light warm her cheek, and let herself breathe. The climb back was only beginning, but for the first time in years, she felt like the path might be walked in daylight. The first light after the leak brought cameras and microphones and a kind of chaos that wasn't designed for marching, it was designed for questions. Investigators arrived in suits and careful shoes, their faces polite and unreadable. Senators' aides called. News vans parked just outside Fort Redwood's gate like scavengers waiting for the kill. For the first time since she'd buried her team, Ariana watched the story of Alpha 9 move from whispers into the brightness of other people's attention. That attention was messy and necessary. It meant the people who had been erased would finally have names spoken aloud in places that used to pretend they didn't matter. Public hearings started within days. Emily, Ariana, she corrected herself in the mirror once, feeling the old name strike like an echo, sat under bright lights as committees read the leaked documents and asked for explanations. Major Pierce was the easy case. He'd been careless enough to leave breadcrumbs and decisive enough to be caught on the edges of his own trap. The press parade around him made it look like a contained scandal. But the thing about systems built to hide is that they have many roots. For every hand dragged into the light, 3 others slithered into a different shadow. The work of cleaning would be slower than any public pronouncement. It would also be deeper. Inside Fort Redwood, the atmosphere was complicated. Some Marines felt vindicated, those who had questioned Delta and the cover-ups felt a painful relief. Others felt exposed and humiliated, pushed to examine whether following orders without scrutiny could be moral at all. Parker faded into administrative limbo. He wasn't arrested, not yet. The bureaucracy has ways of swallowing inconvenient people, desk duty, slow promotions, paperwork that never ends. That felt like punishment for some and insult for others. Logan watched all of it with a soldier's flat attention. He stayed close to Ariana but never crowded. There are things you share in the field that don't travel well into courtrooms and cameras. Ariana used the hearings as a platform for something she'd spent years avoiding, truth without theatrics. She read lists, names of her team, the dates of their deaths, the things intentionally left out of official reports. She did not dramatize, she recited. That steadiness became its own kind of thunder. People listened. Families who had been given sanitized briefings decades earlier now had raw testimony to hold on to. The public reacted in fits, outrage, then debate, then finally a stubborn persistence that demanded policy reviews and oversight. For the soldiers on the ground, the change was practical: stricter labeling, independent liaisons, transparent chains for intel. For the men in offices, it was slower and meaner: adaptations that threatened old alliances were negotiated until they were less dangerous but still alive. Not everyone was satisfied. Some critics said Ariana had broken the law to expose the truth and should be punished equally. They saw leaks as breaches of security, a slippery slope to chaos. That argument had moral weight. Secrets sometimes mattered for real operational security, but it collided with the fact that those same secrets had been used to bury lives. The debate made headlines and filled comment threads with people who had never seen a deployment but felt certain they knew the right answer. Ariana learned quickly that winning the truth didn't make the world neat, it made it loud. On quieter days, away from microphones, she helped set up a memorial for Alpha 9. Logan and the team, Maya and Benny among them, worked to place a simple plaque in the base courtyard, names carved with more care than any form had given them. Soldiers and civilians turned up, some with medals pinned to their chest, others with tears they tried to hide. When Ariana stood before the stone and read the names, she felt small and enormous at the same time: small because nothing could replace the lives, enormous because naming was work, and work matters. The plaque was a promise more than a monument. It promised remembrance, but it also promised scrutiny. It promised that the cost would no longer be invisible. The system tried to reassert itself in small ways. Files that should have been accessible became buried in redactions. Witnesses moved away or were reassigned. But the initial leak had already built momentum. Congressional oversight committees asked for audits. Independent journalists dug through phone records and found threads that led to other installations. A few low-level officers faced charges. A faint tremor of accountability traveled up the ladder. For Ariana, each small victory felt like a bandage: necessary, helpful, but never the whole cure. She still woke to the faces of the men she couldn't bring back. Some nights the guilt pressed against her like a weight. Other nights she let the memory be a compass: this is why I am here. Her relationship with Logan deepened into something practical and stubborn. They shared a quiet understanding that what they had done was not a clean victory, it was a start. He refused to let her go back into hiding. "You did the right thing," he said once, and it wasn't a bomb so much as a direction: keep moving. They planned reforms together, testified about logistics and oversight, and advised on how to make it harder for the kind of cover-up that had ended Alpha 9. Their bond was a map of small acts: protecting a witness, arranging a secure archive, sitting with a family who needed the whole truth. By the time winter reached the base, the daylight felt less fragile. Policies had changed, if only in draft and committee. Pierce sat in a detention wing that had glassed windows with a view of the desert. His arrogance had become a kind of loneliness. Parker still wore his uniform but with a blank place where his swagger used to be. Fort Horizon's directorate was dissolved pending review. Files were cross-checked. The world had not fixed itself, but a crack had been forced open. Through that crack, light reached places it hadn't in years. Ariana stood one evening on the ridge where she had once watched lights at Fort Horizon and thought about the path ahead. The road back would be long: policies to change, people to protect, reputations to repair. She no longer wanted to disappear. The work was ugly and vital, and she had learned to trade silence for consequence. She had lost a team and found a mission. The truth had been costly, but it bought something rare: accountability. The fight was not over. But for the first time since Burn Light, she could imagine a future where names meant something more than paperwork. That future didn't arrive like a parade. It arrived in small, stubborn increments: a file unredacted here, a policy memo signed there, a letter from a family with words that trembled on the page and then steadied into thanks. Ariana found that hope was not a static thing, it required tending. She woke earlier, not out of insomnia but because there were calls to make, people to meet, reforms to draft. The work was tedious and merciless in its own way: committee hearings, endless deposition edits, security briefings where each word could be twisted into closure or danger. She learned to carry the fatigue the way she carried a heavy pack: organized, evenly distributed, never allowed to slam into the ground. Logan was at her side through most of it, but not in the romanticized way that stories sometimes sell. He was there like a hinge, steady, necessary, not flashy. They stopped pretending the world would reward them for bravery. Instead, they became architects of the boring and persistent things that actually changed systems, chain of custody protocols that couldn't be gamed, mandatory third-party audits for mission intel, secure whistleblower channels. They pushed until the brass grumbled, and then they pushed some more until small policy shifts became procedure. That was the subtle victory, paperwork that couldn't be abused anymore. Not everyone celebrated. Careers were bruised, some permanently. Men who had built environments of plausible deniability found themselves without a script. Parker retreated to a desk and then to a quieter corner of the base where he could complain to anyone who'd listen about how the times had changed. Pierce's fall was spectacular and devastating. He had allies and he had enemies, and the investigation peeled back layers until his complicity was undeniable. The public wanted a head and a scapegoat. Ariana wanted more than a scapegoat. She wanted systems that made scapegoats unnecessary. The memorial for Alpha 9 became more than a stone in the courtyard. It became a ritual place where recruits read names aloud and officers were expected to attend and listen. Families came on anniversaries and stayed to speak. The base instituted a small scholarship fund in the unit's name for logistical students, a modest but meaningful way to turn loss into future capacity. Each act was a stitch in a long repair job. None of it smoothed the raw edges entirely, but slow stitches hold better than dramatic stitches. At nights when the calls stopped and the world grew thin at the edges, Ariana still walked the ridge above Fort Horizon. The desert had a silence that didn't mean peace, it meant space to think. Sometimes Logan joined her. Sometimes Maya would call from a different time zone, her voice rough from late-night work but fierce with purpose. Benny would send a text with a photo of some ridiculous meal he'd made during an inspection shift, a small ridiculousness that kept them human. Those threads of ordinary life helped keep the extraordinary from swallowing them. The fallout bled into places they hadn't expected. Congressional hearings opened doors to other investigations. Journalists followed leads into procurement offices, into private contractors, into the messy entanglements of policy and profit. People who had been discouraged from asking now asked, and the answers were often ugly. But ugliness without secrecy is at least honest. The pain became public, and that made accountability possible. It didn't mean every family got the closure they wanted, but it meant the system could not pretend the deaths were accidents anymore. Ariana sometimes imagined the men of Alpha 9 in small, ordinary scenes, Jenkins humming while checking a motor, Alvarez teaching someone to tie a knot, Stone laughing at a bad joke. Those images were private and fierce. She guarded them like the last unburnt pages of a journal. The hearings read the facts, the public read the memos, but those little mental vignettes were where she kept the truth alive. These weren't case numbers, they were people who had tasted life and given it up on someone else's orders. There were costs. The burden of truth sometimes isolated her from old friends who wanted things less messy. Careers stalled, relationships strained, nights became longer. But in that cost she found a different kind of currency, trust. People who stayed were the ones who would stand in a storm with her. New recruits who had watched the memorial readouts came up to her, eyes awkward with gratitude and shame both, and asked how to serve honorably. She told them the simplest thing she could: listen when orders don't add up, speak up when something feels wrong, and remember that a command isn't sacred if it kills without reason. In the end, the real measure of what they'd done wasn't in headlines or in Pierce's indictment. It was in the slow rearrangement of how things were done. It was in a junior officer who felt safe to question a directive, in a systems admin who refused to scrub a report, in families who could get a truthful account instead of a neat report. Ariana watched these small acts like a gardener watching shoots in spring, impatient, hopeful, hands ready to prune and protect. One evening, a year after the leak, the base held a ceremony. The plaque for Alpha 9 had fresh flowers and more names of people who had since stepped forward to right wrongs. Ariana stood at the edge, not at the podium. she'd learned to let the moment be about others. Logan stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, a quiet ally in a noisy world. She thought of the choices that had led her here, the decision to step into a wreck that first day, the decision to break the law to reveal a greater wrong, the decision to stay and fix rather than disappear again. She didn't have catharsis in some cinematic sense. There was only a steadying, like an ocean finding its level after a storm. The work would continue, systems rot in ways that require constant tending. But there was also something like gratitude, to have names spoken aloud, to have mistakes acknowledged, to have the burden of secrecy lifted from those who had carried it too long. As the ceremony wound down and soldiers drifted back to their routines, Ariana walked away from the crowd and looked out at the ridge where the sun sank slow and sure. Her scars ached in the cool air. She touched the plaque with a fingertip, felt the cold stone and the letters carved deep, and for a moment she let herself imagine the future she'd been trying to build, a place where names are never just paperwork again. She breathed in the desert air, steady and certain, and then she walked back toward the light, toward the next problem, the next act of repair, the next day where the work of remembrance would continue.